Every man at the Hardin County tax sale on the third Tuesday of March 2009 looked at the same 12 acres and made the same calculation. The calculation took about 4 seconds. You looked at the water standing knee-deep between the apple trees. You looked at the dead grass floating on top of it, pale and matted like something washed out of a barn. You smelled it. That particular smell of standing cold water over old clay that meant the ground had been wet since at least October, maybe longer. And then you looked away. Because 12 acres of drowned orchard in the river bottom of Union Township wasn't land. It was a problem someone else had left behind. Every man in that room agreed on this. The county agreed, which was why they were selling it for back taxes rather than trying to collect. The starting bid was $15. There were no competing bids. The only hand in the room belonged to a boy named Gideon Pratt, who was 16 years old, wore a coat 2 sizes large for him, and held a brown envelope with $15 in it that he had saved from shoveling driveways. Nobody laughed out loud. This is important to say plainly, because they weren't cruel people. They were farmers and county clerks and one retired extension agent named Earl Bunton, who had spent 31 years advising people in Hardin County, Iowa, on what their land could and couldn't do. What they did was something quieter than laughter. They looked at the boy, looked at the flooded ground on the county map pinned to the corkboard, looked back at the boy, and then looked away again. Not unkind, just finished with the subject. Earl Bunton told this story for years afterward. He was 73 by then, retired 6 years, living on a half-section outside Eldora that his wife ran with soybeans and patience. He said he remembered the boy's coat. He remembered thinking the coat was his father's. He didn't know why that stuck with him. He just said it did. If you grew up around people who worked with their hands and didn't say much about it, hit subscribe before we go any further. We're going to keep telling stories like this one, as long as you keep watching. The tax sale was held in the basement of the Hardin County Courthouse on a morning that smelled of floor wax and old paper. There were 11 parcels on the list. The first 10 moved quickly. A strip of road right-of-way nobody wanted. A half-acre of timber the county had been trying to unload since 2003. A few scattered lots in the town of Hubbard that hadn't had structures on them since the 1990s. Gideon Pratt sat through all of them in a folding metal chair in the back row, the brown envelope in his lap. He had driven himself. He did not have a driver's license. He had borrowed his mother's 2001 Chevy Silverado with the understanding that he was going to the library. This detail he disclosed to Earl Bunton later and asked him not to repeat it, though clearly he eventually did. 12 people were in the room when the orchard parcel came up. A county clerk named Diane Mershon ran the sale from a folding table at the front, working through her clipboard with the practiced speed of someone who had places to be. She read the parcel number. She described the acreage. She noted the back taxes owed, $214, and explained that the successful bidder would assume responsibility for those. She set the opening bid at $15. She looked up. Gideon Pratt raised the brown envelope. Diane Mershon looked at him for a moment. Then she looked around the room. Then she looked back at him. Any other bids? There were none. She marked the sheet. She told him to bring the envelope to the window. He bought 12 acres of flooded orchard in the river bottom of Union Township, Hardin County, Iowa, for $15. Plus $214 in assumed back taxes, for a total outlay of $229. This is a fact that sounds invented. It isn't. The orchard had belonged to a man named Harold Fett, who had planted it in the late 1970s with his brother and run it for about 20 years, selling apples and cider at the county fair and through a small farm stand on Route 175. Harold died in 2001. His brother had moved to Arizona. The property sat. The drainage tile that had kept the river bottom land workable, 40-year-old clay tile running under the whole 12 acres in a grid pattern, had been collapsing since the late 1990s, slowly and then faster, the way things tend to go. By 2005, the lowest 3 acres were wet most of the year. By 2007, 8 of the 12 flooded every spring and didn't fully drain until July, which meant you couldn't get equipment on it. The apple trees, the ones still standing, had been drowning at the root for 4 years. They wouldn't bear fruit again. The county assessor had written the land value down to essentially nothing, $180 an acre on paper, uncollectible in practice, which was why the taxes had gone unpaid and the county had finally filed. Gideon Pratt knew about the drainage tile. He knew because his grandfather, Walter Pratt, had known Harold Fett since before Gideon was born and had walked those 12 acres with him more than once in the 1980s when the orchard was producing well. Walter kept a ledger, not a metaphorical ledger, an actual red-spined composition book with land notes written in marker on the cover. And he had written down the drainage map in 1986, when Harold had shown it to him as a point of pride. Harold had been proud of that tile work, had done most of it himself. 80-foot spacing, 12-inch headers running to a single outlet at the northeast corner, tying into a county ditch. Walter had drawn a rough sketch. He had noted the outlet elevation. He had noted the tile size and depth, which was 14 inches down on the laterals, 18 on the mains. Walter Pratt died in February of 2007, when Gideon was 14. He left the ledger to Gideon because Gideon was the only one who read it. The rest of the family found this touching and a little unusual. His uncle, David Pratt, told Gideon gently that a notebook full of drainage maps and soil observations from the 1970s and 80s wasn't exactly a fortune. Gideon said he knew. He didn't argue. He took the ledger home and put it on his shelf and read the whole thing twice before spring. Walter Pratt had been a particular kind of farmer. Not wealthy, not famous, just extremely observant and constitutionally opposed to throwing information away. He had farmed 320 acres in Hardin County for 40 years, working in corn and soybeans and a rotating cover of oats, and he had made small, careful notes about everything he observed. Rainfall, drainage behavior, soil color changes after a wet year, which fields recovered fast, and which ones held water in their low corners long into June. He had opinions about tile spacing that his neighbors found exhausting. He believed that most flooded bottomland in central Iowa wasn't drowned because the water table was too high or the soil too poor. He believed it was drowned because the drainage infrastructure was old and failing, and that if you fixed the tile, the water would go where water always goes when you give it a path, away. He had said this to Gideon many times. He had said it the way some grandfathers quote scripture, not to instruct, exactly, but because it was something he believed down to his bones and couldn't quite stop saying out loud. Gideon had listened. That was the thing about Gideon. The thing Earl Bunton tried to describe every time he told the story. Not smart, exactly, not aggressive, just uncommonly willing to sit still and listen to someone older than him talk about something they knew. Most kids that age, Earl said, they hear an old man talking about drainage tile and their eyes go to the middle distance. Gideon would lean forward. He had done it in Earl's own extension meetings, the 2 or 3 times his grandfather had brought him along. Earl hadn't thought much about it at the time. He thought about it later. What Gideon knew, from the ledger and from memory of his grandfather's voice on the subject, was this. Harold Fett's drainage system had been built right. 80-foot spacing was good spacing for river-bottom clay in that part of Iowa. The tile was clay, not perforated plastic, which meant it was probably cracked in places from age and root intrusion, but the layout was sound. The outlet at the northeast corner tied into the county ditch, which was maintained. The problem wasn't the design. The problem was that something had failed. A header section, probably, or the outlet itself had silted in or shifted. And without a functioning outlet, the whole system backed up. Water that had nowhere to go sat. It had been sitting for years, long enough that most people looking at the land had stopped thinking about drainage at all and started thinking about the water as a permanent feature. Gideon didn't think of it as permanent. He thought of it as a blocked pipe. He spent the month of April 2009 walking the 12 acres in rubber boots he'd owned since he was 12 and had to wear 2 pairs of wool socks inside to make fit. He probed the ground with a piece of rebar to find the tile lines, working from the sketch in his grandfather's ledger. He found the northeast outlet, or what was left of it. A section of 12-inch clay header had collapsed about 30 feet from the ditch bank, dropping the tile down about 4 inches below its original grade. Water couldn't flow uphill. Everything behind that section was backed up. The fix, as Gideon saw it, was to dig out the collapsed section, relay it at grade, and reconnect it to the outlet. He had no backhoe. He had a long-handled spade, a come-along, a box of rope, and a neighbor named Don Greer who was 68 years old and owed Walter Pratt what he described as a favor that doesn't expire. Don Greer had a Case 580 backhoe that was older than Gideon and ran on faith and used hydraulic fluid. It took them parts of 5 weekends, working when the ground was low enough to operate on, starting from the outlet and working back. They replaced 11 feet of collapsed tile with 4-inch perforated PVC pipe. Not ideal, Gideon knew, but workable as a splice, and reset the grade with a cheap laser level Don had bought at an estate sale and never returned. They rebedded the outlet section in pea gravel. They patched the connection to the county ditch with a rubber boot coupling. The whole repair cost $340 in materials and nothing in labor, because Don Greer said the favor covered it. Nobody came to watch. There was nothing to watch, mostly 2 people digging in a flooded field with an old backhoe. On a Saturday in late April 2009, in the river bottom of Union Township, that's not the kind of thing that draws a crowd. The water started moving in the first week of May. Not fast, nothing dramatic. The water level in the lowest part of the orchard dropped 3 inches in 9 days, which sounds like very little, and is in fact a great deal when you understand what it means for 12 acres of clay soil that has been saturated for 4 consecutive years. By the end of May, the low corner had dropped another 7 inches. By mid-June, for the first time since approximately 2005, you could walk into the orchard without losing a boot. Gideon had brought 24 khaki Campbell ducks onto the property in early May, before the drainage was complete. Because the flooded ground was extraordinary habitat for them, and because he had calculated that the ducks would earn more per week on that flooded acreage than any other use he could put it to, while it was still wet. He'd read about duck tractor operations in a farming magazine from 1997 that his grandfather had kept in a box in the barn. He sold the eggs at a farm stand his mother agreed to host at the end of their driveway. Not much money, about $60 a week through the spring. But it covered the cost of feed and kept the property in use while the drainage work finished. Here is the detail Earl Bunton always paused on when he told the story, because he said he couldn't explain it, and he was a man who had spent his career explaining things. In the second week of June 2009, Gideon's ducks went quiet. He noticed it because they had been loud. Cocky Campbells are talkers, particularly in water. And 24 of them on a flooded field make a continuous racket from first light to about 10 in the morning. One morning, they stopped. Not scared quiet, just done. He walked the property that evening and found them clustered on a dry ridge near the fence line that had not been dry since he'd bought the place. They were sleeping in a line in the last of the afternoon sun. The ground beneath them was firm. He checked with his rebar. Dry 18 inches down. He didn't know what to make of it at the time. He told his mother about it at dinner. She said maybe the ducks knew something. He said maybe. He didn't know if he believed that. He still doesn't, he said since. But it was true that the ducks had moved to the highest dry ground on the property the day it became the highest dry ground on the property. And they hadn't gone back to the water after that. He relocated them to a pond his uncle had on a neighboring farm 3 days later. They went without complaint. They had what they needed, and so did he. By August of 2009, 8 of the 12 acres had drained enough to support a tractor. The soil was soft. You wouldn't want to run anything heavy, but a 2-wheel drive Ford 4000 that Don Greer kept for light work handled it without issue. Gideon seeded the drained ground to winter wheat in September, primarily because winter wheat was cheap seed and would establish cover on the wet, exposed soil before it could erode. He spent $214 on seed. He planted it himself with a John Deere grain drill he borrowed from the same neighbor for the cost of a tank of diesel. He was 17 by then. He was a junior at Beclow High School in Conrad, Iowa. He played no sports. He had no particular reputation. He was not, by any account from people who knew him at the time, the sort of young man you would expect to be quietly farming 12 reclaimed river bottom acres in his off hours. He just was. The winter wheat came in well in the spring of 2010. He sold it to a co-op elevator in Radcliffe for $4 a bushel. The 12 acres yielded 4 bushels per acre on the drained ground, not exceptional given the soil's history, but a real number from ground that 2 years earlier had been underwater. That first wheat check came to $1,147. 36, he had spent $229, miles on the land, $340, on tile repair materials, $214, on seed, and roughly $80 in diesel reimbursement across the whole operation. His total investment was $863. His first year's net was $684. 36, not a fortune. He planted corn the following year on 8 acres and soybeans on 3, rotating according to a plan he had written out in a notebook of his own, the same kind of red-spined composition book his grandfather had used, from the same drugstore, because they still sold them. The corn came in at 174 bushels per acre. Corn in Hardin County that year averaged 181, which was better ground than Gideon was farming, so 174 on reclaimed bottomland was considered, by people who knew what they were looking at, a very strong number. The soybean acres yielded 47 bushels. Combined gross that year was $28,340 at fall prices. People in Union Township started noticing around 2011. Not because Gideon made any announcement, because the field was green and full of corn where there had been standing water. And eventually, when you drive past a thing enough times, your brain decides it has a question. Earl Bunton heard about it from a farmer named Roy Caskey, who ran ground adjacent to the Fett Orchard parcel. Roy called Earl because Roy remembered Earl from his extension days and figured Earl would know what was behind it. Earl didn't know what was behind it. He drove out and walked the field with Gideon on a Saturday in September of 2011. Gideon showed him the tile repair, showed him the ledger, showed him his grandfather's sketch of the outlet system. Earl stood in the middle of 12 acres of harvested corn stubble, dry, firm, crumbling pleasantly under his boots, and was quiet for a while. He asked me, Gideon said later, why nobody else had seen it. Gideon said he didn't have a good answer for that. He thought maybe they'd looked at the water and stopped. He thought maybe they hadn't had his grandfather's notebook. He thought maybe you had to grow up hearing a man talk about drainage tile the way most people talk about weather before you could look at a flooded field and see something other than a flooded field. He is 32 now. He farms 340 acres in Hardin County, most of it rented, about 60 acres owned. The original 12 are still in his name. He expanded the drainage system in 2014. New perforated plastic laterals, the old clay tile mapped and spliced where it still held. The whole outlet rebuilt to current county specs. He had the soil tested that year too. The bottomland clay in Union Township, the county extension office told him, had above-average organic matter from the decades of decomposed plant matter that had accumulated while the ground was flooded. It was, in the language of the soil report, well suited to row crops once drainage was established. Walter Pratt had said essentially the same thing 30 years earlier in a red notebook. He just hadn't known which ground he was talking about yet. Don Greer died in 2015. Gideon attended the funeral. He doesn't say much about it when the story comes up. Earl Bunton retired a second time from the habit of telling people what to do with their farms, he said, though by most accounts this retirement has not fully taken. He still occasionally calls Gideon with observations. Gideon still picks up. The ducks are gone. Long gone. But Gideon said something once to a reporter from the Iowa State Extension newsletter who was writing a short piece on young farmers in Hardin County. He said the ducks were the only part of the whole thing he couldn't really explain. The tile work he could explain. The wheat, the corn, the math, all explainable, but the ducks going quiet on the first day, the ground beneath them came dry. He said he didn't know what to do with that. He just filed it away. He said his grandfather would have written it down. There's a kind of knowing that doesn't come from school and doesn't come from the internet and can't be looked up when you need it. It comes from paying attention to someone older than you for long enough that their way of seeing starts to feel like your own. Walter Pratt spent 40 years watching water move through clay soil in central Iowa, and he wrote it all down in a composition book, and he gave it to the only person who would read it. He was gone before the 12 acres came up for sale. He never saw the corn. He never saw the wheat check. But the boy who walked into the Hardin County tax sale in March of 2009 with a brown envelope and a coat 2 sizes large, that boy was mostly Walter Pratt in different shoes. The ground teaches you if you stay on it long enough. The trick is staying.